Mussolini and his fascists were violent nationalists who believed in the systematic use of violence. Fascist black shirts attacked all who opposed them, like liberals and Catholics, but their main target was socialists, who threatened the revolution like the one in Russia. In October 1922, fascists seized provinces across northern Italy, then marched on Rome in their thousands to demand power through force of arms. The king gave in and made Mussolini the world's first fascist prime minister. He became a dictator. This is the story of Mussolini in power, a story of mass adulation, a story of dreams of empire, of a disastrous alliance with Hitler, and of military failures and ignominious death, all told for the first time in color. From his earliest days in power, Mussolini's main aim was to restore the glories of the ancient Roman Empire. And his main frustration was the reality of Italy in the 1920s.
Disorganized, chaotic, unstable. That was a far cry from the Roman Empire, when Italy had been great, when it had really dominated the Mediterranean, and it had had its own massive empire. And Mussolini looked back to the past and thought, we should be there again.
Mussolini modeled his behavior on the Roman emperors. To equal their ruthlessness, Mussolini would betray anyone, even loyal, devoted fascist families ready to die for their country. He would even betray his own family, his son-in-law and favorite daughter. Once in power, Mussolini started to build the world's first totalitarian state, bending all institutions and people to his will. To build a new type of Italian, Mussolini knew he had to start with the young.
La nostra patria.
In 1925, Mussolini decreed,
"The government demands that the school be inspired by the ideals of fascism."
Adesso bambini leggiamo una poesia di Giuseppe Zucca, Duce chiamaci.
Children were ordered to believe, obey, fight. From the age of 4, they were dragooned into fascist youth organizations, which supplied them with toy guns and black shirts.
Duce, Duce chiamaci.
Duce, Duce chiamaci.
La voce degli eroi.
La voce degli eroi.
School poems taught children to be ready to fight for fascism whenever the leader needed them.
La gran voce dei martiri.
La gran voce dei martiri.
In schools, I tried to inculcate patriotism, and they tried to persuade all school children that patriotism and fascism are the same thing.
Fu in pericolo.
Every school children would have to sort of write an essay on why I love Mussolini, or why Mussolini is the greatest man of the 20th century.
Quando, punto, punto.
As well as propaganda for the masses, Mussolini also created a repressive police state to enforce obedience to fascism.
They had a very powerful machine, both created by the Fascist Party and also just by the state police, extremely far-reaching machine for surveillance, for spying. I mean, very little went on that the Fascist police, or one of the various Fascist polices, didn't know about. And there were enormous numbers of actions carried out by the police every week.
Mussolini had enormous power, but knew he still had to appease the 99% of Italians who were Catholics. And the Vatican also wanted a deal.
As a result of the Risorgimento, Italian unification in the 19th century, the Church lost its status, and it lost its property. It lost its the papal states vanished. So from 1870 until 1929, the Pope really had no country.
In 1929, Mussolini and the Vatican signed the Lateran Pacts, giving the Church virtually everything it wanted. The Pope gained control of the Vatican City as a sovereign state and received 1.75 billion lira in compensation for historic losses, mostly in government bonds.
And the government bonds obviously meant that in some curious way, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, was underwriting the fascist state. And people at the time warned this was a very dangerous thing to be doing. The Vatican had committed itself to fascism for the foreseeable future. It had no confidence in the capacity of democracy to protect Italy against communism.
Pope Pius XI proclaimed that Mussolini was that man whom divine providence had allowed him to meet. He soon proved him very wrong. At the start of his dictatorship, Mussolini wanted to create a totalitarian nation of fascists. Loyalty to the party mattered, not race. In 1929, he invited a group of fascist Jews to meet him. Many Jews had welcomed fascism as the rebirth of the Risorgimento, the 19th century nationalist movement that had unified Italy and set the Jews free from the ghetto. Their leader that day was Ettore Evazzo, a wealthy Turin banker. He wrote joyously about the experience in his diary.
He welcomes us with a slight smile. He is serene. Seated at his desk, he motions to us to advance. It was the first time I was to see the face of Il Duce up close.
Ettore, with his two brothers, had fought in the First World War and then joined the new fascist party. Ettore joined the Black Shirt militia and took part in their violence against socialists. To meet the Duce was the fulfillment of a dream for Ettore.
On hearing of my affirmation for the unshakable loyalty of Italian Jews to the fatherland, His Excellency Mussolini looks me straight in the eye and says with a voice that penetrates straight down to my heart, "I have never doubted it."
Grazie.
Ettore was overcome with a wave of emotion. Later, Mussolini would turn a blind eye when the Nazis sent thousands of Italian Jews to their death. Mussolini knew Italy had to be modernized before he could create a fascist empire to rival ancient Rome. The fascists introduced a policy of self-sufficiency for agriculture and industry. Massive public works programs to drain marshes and build roads created jobs and were hugely popular. But for Mussolini, their main aim was to prepare the Italian economy for war. The first armed conflict came with a popular rising in Libya, Italy's most important colony.
The Italians had become increasingly ruthless. They'd use mass rapes, desecration of mosques, rounding up civilians into concentration camps, mass starvation, the use of chemical weapons against civilians and guerrilla combatants.
100,000 civilians were probably killed between 1929 and 1932 in the pacification of Libya, as it was called. So it's really outside of Italy, in the foreign wars, the colonial campaigns, that fascism showed its particularly violent and brutal side.
In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Mussolini regarded Hitler as a junior partner who had copied him in his rise to power, but he was jealous of Germany's military power.
He realized that Hitler's rise to power was going to destabilize the situation in Europe, And this destabilization would begin to open a window of opportunity for Italy's action.
Ettore Ovazza, the Jewish banker, worried that this was potentially a tragic turning point for Italian Jews. But to his relief, Mussolini ridiculed Hitler's racial theories.
Nothing will make me believe that biologically pure races can be shown to exist today.
But in 1934, when 2 Turin Jews were caught smuggling anti-fascist literature into Italy, some newspapers called it a Jewish anti-fascist plot. Ettore panicked, fearing the return of Jewish persecution. He started his own newspaper to publicly demonstrate that Jews were patriotic and pro-fascist.
We are soldiers. We are fascists. We want to kiss the tricolour flag, for which we are always ready to fight and die.
There was no automatic reason Mussolini and Hitler would be allies, despite their shared views. They first clashed over Austria. Italy wanted it to be independent, rather than part of Germany. Hitler, however, had other ideas.
If one reads the very first page of Mein Kampf, Hitler's infamous book, the first thing he says is Austria must yet again return to the German mother country. And it wasn't just rhetoric, he meant it.
In 1934, Mussolini had made Galeazzo Ciano, his son-in-law, head of his press office. Just 4 years earlier, Ciano seemed to have made the best career move ever. Aged 27, he married Benito Mussolini's adored daughter, Edda. This relationship would end in a family tragedy of Shakespearean intensity. But in 1934, Ciano hero-worshipped Mussolini, imitating his gestures, his uniforms, and his speech. Ciano's first job was to ridicule the Führer. After Mussolini and Hitler clashed over Austria, Ciano briefed journalists that Hitler was a madman, hell-bent on world war. But the Duce's dreams of empire would draw him inexorably into an embrace with the Nazi leader. In 1935, fascist forces invaded Ethiopia, Africa's last independent nation. Ciano was among the 600,000-strong Italian invasion force. He took part in bombing raids on civilians and proudly boasted, "We have carried out a slaughter."
The way that Mussolini dealt with the Ethiopian question, I think, shows just how calculated and ruthless the man really was.
The Ethiopians fought back desperately.
So then the order was issued by Mussolini in December 1935 to make widespread use of chemical weapons, mustard gas and phosgene, and to use terror tactics en masse.
The Italians even deliberately bombed 19 Red Cross hospitals. Over 250,000 Ethiopians were killed in the fighting.
Molto tempo si è cercato di nascondere che la guerra d'Etiopia e altre forme di repressione coloniale del fascismo avessero fatto ricorso a mezzi così spietati. Oggi questo lo sappiamo e credo che abbia aggiunto qualche elemento in più, soprattutto per contestare coloro i quali tendono oggi a presentare il fascismo come una benevola dittatura patriottica che fu inquinata e portata alla perdizione soltanto dall'alleanza con la Germania.
Ethiopia wasn't just about the Italians conquering Ethiopia, it was about them taking on the international order. It was about challenging the predominant Mediterranean powers, the British and the French, for eventual control. That battle, that route to global war, started really in Europe with the Ethiopian crisis of 1935.
Mussolini's aggressive foreign policy was hugely popular at home, but poisoned relations with Britain and France. Mussolini knew that in contrast to Britain and France, he had Hitler's backing in Ethiopia. And then both dictators backed General Franco when he rose against a left-wing government in Spain. Mussolini sent 80,000 Italian troops to fight for Franco in the ensuing Spanish Civil War. As the European crisis mounted, Mussolini promoted his 33-year-old son-in-law Ciano to the key post of Foreign Secretary. But the more time Ciano spent with the Nazis, the more he feared for Italy's future. Ciano started to keep a secret diary, which survives as one of the most remarkable insider accounts in 20th century history. One of the first entries describes Mussolini's visit to Hitler in Berlin in 1937.
Mussolini captured crowds with his magnetism, his voice, and his impetuous youthfulness. Will the solidarity of the regimes be sufficient to keep two nations whose race, culture, religion and tastes are exact opposites really together?
But Ciano knew that there was no alternative to the Nazis if Italy wanted to challenge the power of Britain and France.
Today, the Rome-Berlin axis is something very real and extremely useful.
The fascists and Nazis provided impressive military support to Franco, practicing techniques they would perfect in the Second World War. One was the bombing of civilians to create mass terror. Ciano gloated over its effect in Barcelona.
The entire raid lasted only 1.5 minutes. Buildings pulverized, traffic interrupted, panic that became insanity. 500 dead, 1,500 wounded.
On the 11th of March 1938, Ciano wrote a bare phrase.
6 p.m. Austria is no longer independent.
Without a murmur, Mussolini had allowed Hitler to annex Austria to the Third Reich. Overnight, Italy lost her buffer state, but Mussolini remained fatally captivated by Hitler's ruthlessness. He told Ciano,
Italians must learn to be less sympathetic, to become hard, implacable, hateful, masters.
Mussolini tried to impress Hitler by declaring that Italians were Aryans like the Germans. The Jews were an inferior race.
Formal laws are then passed, effectively disenfranchising the Jewish community in its entirety, kicking them out of public office, kicking Jewish school children out of school, preventing them from attending university, participating in public office.
Ettore Ovazza, the proud patriotic war veteran and devoted fascist, wrote a personal appeal to the Duce.
I write poorly because my hand is trembling. It is the end of a reality, that of our feeling one with the Italian people. How many, starting in 1919 and up until today, have followed you with love through so many battles, wars, living your life? Is all this over? Was it all a dream we nurtured?
Mussolini's first edicts divided the Jews. Long-standing fascists like Ovazza and decorated Jewish veterans were allowed to keep their jobs and businesses, and even to remain fascist party members. Meanwhile, Hitler continued on the road to war. Now he gave Czechoslovakia an ultimatum: give up the German-speaking provinces of Sudetenland or face invasion. Ciano lamented.
Naturally, the objective will be to destroy Czechoslovakia completely. It is war. God protect Italy and the Duce.
Europe held its breath. But at the last moment, Britain begged Mussolini to try to delay the German ultimatum by 24 hours. That evening, Mussolini and Ciano departed for Munich. Hitler told Mussolini he wanted all of the Sudetenland, which had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire but had been ceded to the new state of Czechoslovakia after the First World War. At the Munich conference, Mussolini presented Hitler's plan as his own. All the leaders signed the Munich Agreement that gave Germany the Sudetenland. In return, Hitler promised this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Czechoslovakia was left defenseless, having lost nearly all her mountain fortifications. But appeasement had averted the war. Ciano witnessed the resulting adulation.
In Italy, from the Brenner Pass to Rome, from the king to the peasants, the Duce receives welcomes as I have never seen.
Mussolini won great respect abroad and great popularity at home because he appeared as the peacemaker. But there's a very funny thing about this, that Mussolini himself wasn't at all pleased. He went home muttering, all the crowds are cheering me as the man of peace. But I don't want to be the man of peace. I want to be the man of war.
A few days after this crisis, Mussolini introduced even tougher anti-Semitic laws. These laws ended equality for all Jews, even dedicated fascists. Ettore Ovazza had to sell the family bank and resign from the fascist party.
The Germans never asked the Italians to introduce racial anti-Semitism. There is no evidence to suggest that Mussolini came under pressure from Hitler.
In March 1939, Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement. German troops marched into the rump of Czechoslovakia, the first time they had occupied non-German-speaking territory. Hitler did not even warn Mussolini. Only afterwards, the German ambassador Hess told Mussolini,
"The Führer thanks Italy for unshakable Italian support."
Mussolini was in despair.
Every time Hitler grabs a country, he sends me a message.
The march of fascism seemed unstoppable when Franco finally triumphed in the Spanish Civil War. To keep up with Hitler, Mussolini seized Albania in April 1939. Later that year, Ciano wrote,
First report of imminent action against Poland. War.
For 10 years, Italy had been continually at war. The country was bankrupt, military supplies exhausted. Ciano knew the truth.
We must avoid war.
In 1939, Italy's armed forces were desperately weak. Yet Mussolini ordered his foreign minister Ciano to go to Berlin to sign one of the most disastrous military agreements in history, the Pact of Steel. This required Italy to go to war whenever Germany did. In this agreement, both Germany and Italy promised not to provoke a major European conflict for at least 3 years. But just 3 months later, in Salzburg, Ciano learned directly from Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, of Hitler's real plans.
He said, gazing at me with his cold metallic eyes,
"We want war. Poland must be invaded, defeated, annihilated, and annexed to the Third Reich in the same fashion as Austria and Czechoslovakia."
After meeting Hitler, Ciano knew for sure that war was inevitable.
He has decided to strike, and strike he will. The fate that might befall us does not interest them in the least.
Ciano felt desperate and powerless.
I returned to Rome completely disgusted with Germany and its leaders. They have betrayed us and lied to us.
But even Ciano could not have guessed what was coming next. Hitler stunned Italy with a political masterstroke. He signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, which secretly carved up Poland.
"5:25 a.m. Germany attacks Poland. 11 a.m. Britain declares war on Germany.
Ciano struggled hard to keep Mussolini out of the war.
I must fight to the end. Otherwise, it will mean the ruin of the country, the ruin of fascism, and the ruin of the Duce himself.
Mussolini told Ciano,
"The Italians, after having heard my warlike propaganda for 18 years, cannot understand how I can become the herald of peace, now Europe is in flames."
He is still in international terms a revolutionary, that he is a man with a mission. He has to leave his mark on history by making Italy great or greater. He can't do this without war.
As the Germans swept across democratic Europe in 1940, Mussolini could restrain himself no longer. He declared war on France and Britain. Ciano wrote,
"The adventure begins. May God help Italy."
The most awful, I think the most contemptible reason Mussolini gave for going to war was he said, "We need a few thousand dead in order to be able to sit at the conference table." And he thinks that's going to be it.
In the first month, the Italian army made little progress in its invasion of France. Mussolini blamed his soldiers rather than himself.
It is the material that I lack. Even Michelangelo needed marble to make statues. If he had only clay, he would have been nothing more than a potter.
Mussolini planned to run a parallel war with Germany. While Hitler grabbed territories north of the Alps, he would grab countries around the Mediterranean. Mussolini launched an attack on the British in Egypt, hoping to seize the Suez Canal. The British withdrew. Ciano noted,
"Mussolini is radiant with joy."
At Ciano's urging, and as a way of showing his independence, Mussolini decided to seize Greece without informing Hitler.
It was felt that Greece would be a sort of nice, easy target. It was felt the Greek military weren't up to a fight. The Italians were already in Albania, of course. It was simply a job of stepping over the border and Greece would collapse.
Mussolini had managed to bribe a number of top Greek generals. He assumed because he had various Greek generals on the Italian payroll, they were going to sell out their own army. This wasn't the case.
What actually transpired was the Italians began the offensive with very little planning. It's a very highly improvised operation. The weather was appalling.
This was the autumn, during the time of the autumn rains, very bad weather, to move across Balkan mountains into Greece. The result was that the invasion was a complete failure.
The Greek army dug its heels in, fought back, and pushed the Italians back into Albania. So it was disastrously ill-conceived and disastrously carried out operation.
Mussolini had ignored military advice in ordering the invasion. Yet again, he was furious with his soldiers.
The human material I have to work with is useless, worthless.
Hitler now had to rush troops to invade the Balkans and Greece. Mussolini was humiliated.
The last thing Mussolini wanted was the Germans anywhere in his sphere of operations whatsoever. So to have to admit defeat and then see his principal ally having to occupy not only Greece but also Yugoslavia, which is of course a border state with Italy, was a pretty serious humiliation, and I think marks really the first point when you could say the man or Mussolini's authorities are beginning to erode.
The Italians faced another shattering blow in Libya.
British and Commonwealth armoured spearheads simply went straight through the Italian lines like a knife through butter. Something like 400,000, 500,000 prisoners taken in a very short time by the British as a result. And again, shows the Italians simply are not capable of running, really, of running a modern war.
And now he has to play second fiddle to his ally in Nazi Germany. And this gets worse and worse as time goes on. Every place Italy fought virtually was a defeat for Italy.
From now on, Mussolini was completely in Hitler's hands. At 3 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1941, Mussolini was woken to be told of the German attack on the Soviet Union. There had been no consultation, no forewarning. Mussolini was angry and humiliated.
Even I don't dare disturb my servants at night, but the Germans make me jump out of bed at any hour without the slightest consideration.
Germany was now the absolutely dominant partner in the Axis. Italians felt powerless. The great question in Italy was, who is really the enemy? The popular saying on the streets was, if Britain wins, we lose. But if Germany wins, we are lost. Mussolini shared the very same suspicion. He told Ciano bitterly,
I now seriously ask whether an English victory would not be more desirable for our future than a German victory.
There were massive food shortages across Italy. But Mussolini had no sympathy with his people in their hunger.
I tell you that around springtime, the rations will be even less. And this delights me, because we will finally see signs of suffering on the faces of Italian people, which will be valuable to us around the peace table.
To curry favor with Hitler, Mussolini sent 230,000 ill-equipped troops to join the German invasion of Russia. The secret police reported growing anger over the military disasters.
Indubbiamente l'esperienza dell'Italia fascista sui campi di battaglia, a cominciare dalla disfatta in Grecia nell'ottobre del 40 e poi la perdita dell'impero nel 41 e poi nel 42 la perdita della Libia, rappresenta praticamente il crollo di una grande illusione, cioè che l'Italia, grazie al fascismo, fosse diventata una grande potenza.
In December 1942, Soviet forces defeated Italian troops on the River Don.
La disfatta italiana in Russia, con oltre 85.000 morti, rappresenta in effetti una specie di pietra tombale per le ambizioni di Mussolini e dell'Italia fascista.
1943 began disastrously for the Rome-Berlin axis, the catastrophe of Stalingrad, and a retreat everywhere along the North African front, the fall of Tripoli. Ciano still admired Mussolini, but knew he had to go.
I think that before long it will be necessary to place all powers in the hands of the military.
But Mussolini sacked Ciano for opposing the alliance with Germany.
Our leaving was cordial, for which I am very glad, because I like Mussolini, like him very much, and what I shall miss most will be my contact with him.
Italian defeats escalated through 1943 with mass surrenders to the Allies in North Africa. When Allied forces landed in Sicily, 12,000 more surrendered without firing a shot. 3 years of military disasters had destroyed the foundations of Italian fascism. Finally, on July the 25th, 1943, Mussolini was toppled by a group of leading fascists, who then meekly handed constitutional power back to the king. The Duce, the Iron Dictator, was a broken man. To Mussolini's horror, one of the leaders of the rebellion was Ciano, his own son-in-law, who had been at his side as foreign minister during 6 tumultuous years. This set in train a terrible family tragedy, an echo of the national tragedy about to befall Italy. At first, there was euphoria. 20 years of fascism seemed to have melted away like snow. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio, former head of the armed services, as the new prime minister. Badoglio imprisoned Mussolini and also arrested Ciano, who was accused of massive corruption. But the chance to shorten the war and bring peace to Italy was botched.
It turned out to be a fiasco. The Allies and Badoglio could not coordinate what was going to happen. Badoglio and the king pulled up and left Rome in a disaster, a disgrace, in flight to go head south.
Before fleeing into the welcoming arms of the Allies, the king announced Italy had changed sides.
And the Italian army and the Italian nation just unraveled overnight, the night of September 8th, which is known also in Italian history as the catastrophe.
Italy was traumatized. The Germans moved quickly to take control of the country. Some Italians, outraged by the king's surrender, fought on with the Germans. Others were delighted to join the Allies. Many simply laid down their arms. Italy now faced the horror of civil war. But Hitler still admired Mussolini and personally ordered a daring airborne raid, which successfully rescued him from his mountain prison. Hitler installed Mussolini as head of a new fascist government, the Italian Social Republic, or Salo Republic, in German-occupied northern Italy.
It was a mere puppet government. It was a shadow government. That Mussolini technically ran the country, but he was at under orders of the Germans.
As Italy crumbled into chaos and civil war, the Ovazza family fled Turin and headed for a hotel close to the Swiss border. With Ettore were his wife, Nella, son Riccardo, and daughter, Elena.
It must have been a tremendously complicated and tragic time for him. Fascism had failed visibly. It had collapsed. Mussolini had been deposed. The dreams of greatness had not measured up to reality. And he personally had sacrificed everything for this cause which had now failed.
They had taken with them gold, jewels, and foreign currency. Unknowingly, Ettore was taking them into a very dangerous world.
At the time, there were all kinds of unscrupulous characters and profiteers who are making money off of the desperation of many people who are trying to sneak over into the border into Switzerland.
Riccardo was of military age, and Ettore feared he might be seized. So he found a mountain guide to take Riccardo to Switzerland. Ettore gave his son 50,000 Swiss francs. A few days later, the Ovazzas were enjoying a meal together, until Gestapo officers sat down close to them. Tension filled the room. The Gestapo men told Ettore his son had been arrested for smuggling foreign currency across the border. Ettore was made to pay their bill. The three were taken to a school commandeered by the German SS. Then Ettore Ovazza, the loyal fascist Jew, was led forcibly to the school's basement. Mother and daughter followed, now relaxed, even smiling, as if assured no harm would come to their family. But once inside, all three were brutally executed.
Incredibly, their bodies are then chopped up into pieces. A fire is lit, and they begin to burn these bodies right there in the schoolhouse. It's one of the strange and extraordinary ironies that among the first victims of the German occupation of Italy should be one of the most loyal adherents to fascism.
Ettore was one of the first, but there would be many others. September 1943, the Germans occupied Rome. They immediately sent 5,700 Jews to extermination camps. Another 615,000 Italians were sent into forced labor in Germany. Mussolini, who the Nazis had installed as the head of the Salo Republic puppet government in northern Italy, said nothing. This new fascism was more brutal than ever. One of the first to feel its wrath was Ciano. In prison, he awaited the revenge of the father-in-law he had helped to depose. He wrote the last entry in his secret diary. The rest had already been smuggled to Switzerland by his wife.
The policy of Berlin towards Italy was nothing but a web of lies, intrigue and deceit. We were never treated like partners, but always as slaves. Only Mussolini, in his supreme cowardice, could, without reaction, tolerate this and pretend not to see it.
Mussolini then proved Ciano right. He could have saved his son-in-law, as his daughter begged him to, but that would have betrayed weakness in front of his German masters. This remarkable film of Ciano's execution was made to prove Mussolini's iron resolve and his dedication to Hitler's service. By 1944, it was clear the Axis had lost the war. Yet an astonishing 250,000 Italians still joined Mussolini's new Republican Fascist Party, proving fascism's enduring appeal. 40,000 even joined a new armed force called the Black Brigades to fight anti-fascist partisans during 1944 and 45. These partisans, often led by communists, destroyed communications and attacked German troops. In reprisal, the German SS, supported by the Black Brigades, carried out a brutal campaign of suppression which led to the indiscriminate slaughter of thousands of civilians, often women and children.
This was the nastiest part of the entire regime, particularly inside Italy, because there were a lot of political executions, the liquidations of lots of hostages, mass killings, tens of thousands of people died. This was by far the worst aspect of the regime inside Italy during the entire fascist period. But it was above all a fight for Italy's future.
On April the 27th, 1945, Benito Mussolini, his mistress Clara Petacci, and several fascist leaders were seized by partisans. Ironically, the man who had come to power as the man to stop communism was gunned down by a communist.
He was just cut down by a burst of submachine gun fire from this communist partisan leader. Very dramatic, very, very brutal, if you like. And then, of course, his corpse and that of Clara Petacci were hung up feet first in the piazzale in one of the piazzas of Milan, because the fascists had previously hung a lot of partisans in that same square.
For a lot of people, they said, well, that sounds like the end of fascism to me. Was it? Well, probably not. I mean, fascism went deeper than just Mussolini and his girlfriend and a few others hanging at the gas station.
Once the Allies held Italy, the West once again saw communism as a far greater threat than Italian fascism. Senior judges, civil servants, military leaders and even police chiefs who had served under fascism were allowed to slip quietly back into office. And fascism as a political force did not die with Mussolini.
There is still, right across Italy, a widespread sense of sympathy for this man. an unwillingness to accept that maybe there's a bit more to them than just public works programs, road building and draining marshes. There was a bit more to it than that.
Mussolini's belief in fascism, violence and a desire for empire left Italy with a terrible legacy of death and destruction. And together with Hitler, Mussolini plunged Europe into the most destructive war in history and changed the world forever.